on the coup in Myanmar, what happened and what's next, brought to you by the Asia Society Policy Institute and the Asia Society's Culture as Diplomacy Initiative. I'm Deborah Eisenman, Managing Director of the Asia Society Policy Institute. We're convening today what is certainly a timely discussion, the one I'm honestly sorry we have to have. As we all know, earlier this week there was a coup in Myanmar as the military stopped the new parliament from sitting, arrested the leaders of the ruling National League for Democracy Party, created a new cabinet and declared a new president, dissolved the courts and other institutions, and much more. Here with us today to discuss what happened and what might come next are two experts on Myanmar, Ambassador Scott Marcial, who's joining us at the very early hour of 6 a.m. for him. And he served as U.S. Ambassador to Burma, Myanmar from March 2016 through May 2020. Prior to this post, he was Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for East Asia and the Pacific at the State Department, where he oversaw U.S. relations with Southeast Asia. He was also Ambassador to Indonesia from 2010 to 2013, and was concurrently the first U.S. Ambassador for ASEAN Affairs and Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Southeast Asia before that. He's currently a visiting scholar and visiting practitioner fellow on Southeast Asia for the current academic year at Stanford University's Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center. Also with us today is Mo Thuzar, who's joining us in the evening from Singapore and is a fellow at the ICS Yusof Ishak Institute's Regional Sociocultural Studies program. She also coordinates their Myanmar Studies program. She joined ICS in 2008 after spending 10 years at the ASEAN Secretariat coordinating regional cooperation and social human development projects. One of her first projects after joining ICS was to document in real time ASEAN's coordination to the humanitarian response to Myanmar in the aftermath of Cyclone Nargis. She's a former diplomat and spent last year as a Fox International Fellow at Yale University's Macmillan Center. As we only have an hour for this discussion, let's jump right in. And for those of you watching, you can ask questions via YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, or you can write to us at moderator@asiasociety.org. I'll turn to you now first, Ambassador Marcial. Given the complexities here of Burma's transition, their constitution, and the issue that the military has long held significant controls over governance and the economy, even during the transition. In fact, there was a great op-ed in the New York Times this week rhetorically asking, why take over if you're already in charge? I'd be grateful if you could explain the how and the why this coup happened.
Sure, Deborah, I'll try with the caveat that, I think few of us, and certainly not me, have a great window into the minds of the generals who staged the coup. I think the background, a lot of people know, but there's really been a struggle for power between the military and the pro-democracy forces led by Aung San Suu Kyi, going back certainly as far as 1988 and arguably even before. I think the military ruled from 1962 to 2010. It was a very harsh and repressive rule that really drove the country into the ground in almost every respect. In 2011, the new government that kind of born out of military rule, but a civilian government, elected civilian government with, I should say, via really questionable elections in 2010. But nonetheless, the new government led by former Prime Minister Thein Sein surprised a lot of us by really opening up and having a lot of reforms, opening up the political system, the media, allowing civil society, opening up to the world. And that led over time to increased political participation, including by the longstanding pro-democracy forces, leading in 2015 to national elections that Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD won overwhelmingly. So Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD took office as a civilian government in early 2016. But it's really important to remember this was all under the 2008 constitution that had been written by the military that continued to give the military extensive power, including 25% of the seats in parliament and control over the security ministries. So the military still wasn't answerable to the civilian authorities. My sense is that the military carried out, or at least allowed these reforms to take place, believing that they could control the pace and the extent of them. I don't think their plan was for Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD to win and to end up ruling. So once Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD took office, we saw almost immediately significant tensions between the civilian side and the military side, certainly between Aung San Suu Kyi and the military commander, General Min Aung Hlaing. I think they both felt that they were, as someone put it, they were both born to rule. So those tensions really have been there all along since 2016. There was concern as far back as 2016-17 about the possibility that the military could stage a coup. But the general sense was that the military was invested to some extent in the electoral process and believed that they could win, not the military directly, but the military proxy party, the USDP, with the advantage of the 25% of seats that the military already had in parliament, could win a majority in parliament in 2020. So while Aung San Suu Kyi and her government received a lot of criticism, particularly from the international community over things like the Rohingya issue, lack of progress on the peace process, continued restrictions on political and civil liberties, I think from their perspective, that criticism missed what they saw as the fundamental challenge, which is winning civilian control over the military. And the NLD even sought to achieve that through constitutional amendments late in the tenure. But because of the military's 25% of seats in parliament, they were not able to succeed. Then to get to the coup, the 2020 election, the NLD won an even larger victory, a landslide victory. The military-aligned party, the USDP, was absolutely trounced. The military claimed fraud, and even though the elections weren't perfect, every credible observer agreed that the NLD had won handily. So why the coup? Again, my sense is the military felt threatened, its power threatened, because the NLD had won such a huge mandate. I don't think there was any immediate threat to the military based on that, but I assume there was concern. Second, that the NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi refused to take their concerns about the electoral fraud seriously. Again, I don't think there was significant electoral fraud that affected the results, but this is partly a respect and ego issue, I think, for the military. And third, reportedly, and I don't know this is true, but it's possible, General Min Aung Hlaing was concerned about his own place as he would have to retire this July. And it's long been thought that he wanted to get some kind of position, senior position in the state, in the government, that would allow him to protect himself and the considerable finances that he's managed to put together during his tenure. So those factors seem to combine to cause the military or lead the military to decide to stage a coup. There's been some debate over whether Aung San Suu Kyi should have compromised with Min Aung Hlaing. Neither of them are particularly compromising individuals. You can argue that either way, but in my view, her decision not to give him such a position does not in any way justify a coup. It was a pure power grab. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. So just a quick follow-up. During your time in Myanmar, I know you met with Min Aung Hlaing and you just talked a bit about his motivations. What do you think his end game is here? They talk about how this is a kind of 1-year emergency takeover. Do you think he'll allow a potential return to civilian rule and allow an actual election in a year as currently declared?
It's really hard to say. I've speculated. Again, I've met the general any number of times. I can't say that I have gained great understanding of how he thinks or what his game plan is. So just purely speculating, I think, again, this is about power. There's a lot of different scenarios, and I don't want to, sort of predict something and make that more likely by predicting it. But I think that certainly I would expect the military to do what it can to ensure that it is able to maintain a substantial hold on power, whether that's through direct rule, some kind of elections with adjusted rules. It's really hard to say, but this is an institution that really believes that its role is essential. And despite the fact that the people of the country have consistently voted overwhelmingly to say they don't want the military to run, the military still thinks somehow that it has some destined spot or destined role to be significant players.
Thank you. Mo, if I could turn to you. So we've talked about how Myanmar's fledgling democracy came from a top-down transition to which the military gave effect. They never got the plaudits they wanted. They never democratically won the power that they actually leveraged. But what happens now for the reforms and for the forward momentum of the country? While the COVID pandemic depressed Myanmar's tourism and economy, will the military make any efforts to boost the legal economy, to save or create jobs, and to feed the country's impoverished people?
Thank you. Thank you, Deborah, for those questions. Good morning to everyone tuning in. I'd like to refer back to what Ambassador Martial had also observed about, the recent question you asked about what's the end game and how is this all going to pan out? Because you see, on the 1st of February, there was this notification 1/21 that was issued from the Office of the Commander-in-Chief. And it listed out the so-called tasks that they aimed to accomplish over this 1-year time frame of the imposition of the state of emergency. Of course, the ostensible reason for this military takeover in the first place, the unhappiness over the Union Election Commission's performance and that whole story about voter fraud, that was there in the tasks. But there were 2 points on addressing the COVID-19 pandemic impact, particularly on the economy, and an undertaking to continue with the prevention of the pandemic. As you will recall, vaccinations had just started in Myanmar just days before the coup happened. And, we still have pictures of Daw Aung San Suu Kyi actually observing those first vaccination jabs for medical personnel with a great sense of pride and pleasure on her face. So all of these, of course, now are hanging in the air, and we only have these listed tasks that the military has undertaken to go by. I have heard that there have been moves to ensure business continuity. The regime has called the Union of Myanmar, a Federation of the Chambers of Commerce and Industry, to Naypyidaw to talk about it, and so I think. Again, here it's all really looking into a very murky future, in the sense that we look at the cabinet appointment. Who do they have? Some of them are officials, senior officials from the previous USDP administration under President Thein Sein. But of course, we don't see President Thein Sein a role or voice there. But let me just get back to focusing on the cabinet appointment. For example, the person in charge of the economy is someone who has been doing those kinds of investor relations, investment relations. The person in charge of international cooperation has participated in the track 1, the diplomatic, and the track 2 kind of academic think tank channels of discussion, as well as being a political advisor to President Thein Sein. So these are people who have networks, who have connections, and who probably also know how to use these lobbying networks and so on. The foreign minister was President Thein Sein's foreign minister during the USDP administration of 2011 to 2015. So there are all these things. And again, Ambassador Martial highlighted a very important point, that the military believes and really, I think, takes pride in that they are the most organized institution in the country. So they probably believe that they have that mobilizing ability to again push through the things that they want to do.
Thank you for that. Do you both think, though, that the international community, commerce, for instance, will continue even if they've installed cabinet officials who have done this before and who have some background? For instance, we saw Kirin, the Japanese beer company, today say they're done with Myanmar. So even if the military is looking to maintain some institutions with capable actors, what does that mean for the response from the international community?
I think it's hard to say. I think certainly the coup is going to from a purely commercial point of view, is going to cause a lot of companies that might have been looking at Myanmar to hesitate, certainly both for moral reasons, but also because of questions of stability and uncertainty. How long that lasts, I don't know. I would say that Motuzari, I agree, the military sees itself as the most organized institution. It had a pretty long period in which to prove itself capable, and it failed totally across the board: economics, healthcare, education, unity. The report card from 1962 to 2010 would have been very much a failing report card. I'm not sure that the institution has greatly increased its ability to govern since then. And of course, it would be governing in the face of overwhelming opposition from its own citizens. So I'm skeptical that they're going to be able to achieve much. And the trouble is, as you know, in addition to the human rights and democracy and just pure human costs of this coup, is right now so many people in the country are already suffering because COVID has shut, in addition to the health effects of COVID, it's also just really hurt the economy, especially vulnerable populations. And I think, sadly, we're going to see more suffering because of this, because in the near term, I would expect the economic situation to deteriorate further.
Thank you for that. Mo, if I can turn back to you. So Myanmar has a long history of coups and military takeovers. You lived through the Generation 88 democratic uprising and military crackdown, which led to thousands dead and imprisoned and thousands of activists fleeing the country. The horrible outcomes of the 88 uprising happened at a time when Myanmar didn't have normalized relations with the Western world. And aside from being under junta control, there actually wasn't a global free and open internet anyway. So what differences might we expect to see today in how information is controlled, people move, and commerce continues under this coup?
That's a really interesting question, Deborah. Well, yes, Myanmar in 2021 is not Burma in 1988. Burma in 1988 was at the tail end of a crumbling, mismanaged socialist economy. There have been two devastating demonetization waves, which basically affected all the rungs of society and caused that the democracy uprising, which had such a tragic ending in September 1988. So there was no internet nor satellite discs for cable TV then. The junta could control inflows and outflows of information and could continue the isolation of the country from ingress and egress. So Myanmar today is more connected, and ironically, it is more connected as a result of that very path of democratic transition under this 7-step roadmap to democracy that the military junta had initiated. And so, even during the days when information was controlled, and we saw this very clearly during the 2007 Saffron Revolution, people could find ways to bypass firewalls or even interceptions of communication and so on to get the information out to the world of what is happening in the country. And I think that is even more of a phenomenon now. Yes, there were attempts to limit internet, shut down internet, but people could find VPN, and I think the junta today, even the current what do they call themselves, State Administration Council, SAC. Well, anyway, the regime today is I don't think in a position to be able to shut down or control the flow of information via the internet in a way that, well, given that the means they would love to. They have tried, and they are trying. They are even trying to go after a VPN service and so on. So what we've seen now is this big migration to Twitter and to Signal. And the kind of, I think, messages that people are sending are also very creative. So perhaps the COVID-19 travel restrictions might play into their hands to justify maybe the way that they want to control how people move. But this this cannot continue. It's untenable, in my view, mainly because of the way that the world has changed. The global political and economic climate has changed.
Thanks. Ambassador Marceau, did you want to chime in on that? I see you nodding.
I mean, I don't have a lot to add. Obviously, technology makes control of communications a lot harder, and we're seeing that already. But it's again, it's still such early days, and it's really hard to make predictions about how this is going to play out. But obviously, people in Myanmar, a lot of people are very adept at adapting to find ways around whatever blockages the military is putting in place, at least to date.
Thank you. I want to talk a little bit about nationalism and right-wing movements, as they seem to have proliferated around the world. Mo, if I could turn to you. So the military has been aligning with extremist monks and has pushed an agenda of ardent Burmese Buddhist nationalism. The campaigns against the Rohingya and other ethnic minorities show this, and that they've caused a mass amount of human suffering. In the aftermath of the horrific forced expulsion of the Rohingya, Western leaders and NGOs targeted Aung San Suu Kyi for the Rohingya's tragic plight and for defending the military's campaign against them. While she felt the need perhaps to appease the military and also stand for what her country wanted, which many in the country despise the Rohingya for racist reasons and xenophobic reasons, did her alignment with the military ultimately weaken her government? And did this weakness perhaps strengthen the Commander-in-Chief Min Aung Hlaing?
I think, Deborah, well, ex post facto, I mean, there can be all these assessments, but looking at the Rohingya situation, I think it really crystallized how fine a line that Aung San Suu Kyi was walking. And if I could refer back to Ambassador Martial's overview earlier on, you know, I think she was in a position that she clearly did not have, you know, complete control or say over how the military went about national security, and you know, talking about this need to appease the military. I mean, it's actually how, you know, the weakness that you mentioned has been built into this whole constitutional framework under which the whole political system in Myanmar has had to evolve over this past decade. So let's not also forget that the Rohingya crisis is one that was decades in the brewing, with the military very much in control over their movements and other freedoms. So I think for Aung San Suu Kyi, she had, you know, what she was facing was, you know, first this national psyche that viewed the Rohingya in very black and white terms. And when the case was brought before the ICJ, then she took up the role of defending national interests because I think she really saw this as a case against the country as a whole, and took that up. You know, she took up that defense in that context as a nationalist, like her father maybe. So there are all these different interpretations of nationalism. And I think in the Burmese independence movement tradition, to be a nationalist is to be a patriot. But, you know, the word has been twisted by many people who want to impose their own ultra right-wing type of views to this. And so it has brought the country into a very difficult situation that perhaps even showed up the weaknesses of the way the power structure was for the NLD government, with basically the security appointments and responsibilities lying in the hands of the commander-in-chief in terms of home affairs, defense, and of border affairs. And perhaps because of the way that the Rohingya situation was also presented, it probably, I think, gave the armed forces that kind of national security justification, or even trying to highlight and promote their so-called guardian role to the receptive ears in the country, across the country, who basically then try to look at the situation as an us and them, and you know, the othering process that finds it easy to heap the blame of uncertainties and fears of change on a defenseless community.
Thank you. Ambassador Marcial, this coup was based on the premise of fraudulent elections, and I understand messaging around it was eerily similar to false claims of election fraud that were made by right-wing extremists here in the US. To stop this type of messaging from being used elsewhere and to stand for democracy in Myanmar, what options do the Biden administration and other Western governments have to respond to the coup? And I should say we've gotten a couple of questions coming in asking specifically about targeted sanctions on the military and what kind of option that would look like.
Right. I think, a lot of people have alluded to some similarities in language used by the military to those who were arguing that there was widespread election fraud in the United States. Obviously, the fundamental difference, one of the fundamental differences is that it was the Myanmar military that acted on these not credible claims. In terms of how the international community responds and how the United States responds, it's interesting that you had, for example, the UN Security Council press statement yesterday, which required unanimity, which is quite difficult to achieve these days, that expressed a lot of concern. So I think the concern isn't just about the West. I think there's a lot of concern around the world. Myanmar historically has been, particularly under military rule, a net exporter of conflict and refugees, narcotics. And so I think a lot of countries around the world, whether or not they care greatly about democracy, are concerned about some of the negative consequences that could come from this coup and to the extent military rule continues. So I think it's not just in the West. In terms of options, I'd say a couple things. First, I'm no longer the U.S. ambassador to Myanmar, and so I don't want to speak on behalf of the current U.S. ambassador to Myanmar, whose place it is to address these issues along with senior officials in Washington. But you've seen the Biden administration talk about looking at reviewing sanctions options. I think National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan yesterday spoke about that. I think he also emphasized looking at possible targeted sanctions. There's great awareness of the importance of avoiding things that would cause harm to the public as a whole. But the reality is there's a long history of the international community trying to pressure the top Madao, the military. And, they're not particularly responsive to the international community, either pressure or your so-called sticks or carrots. So I think there's general awareness of that. And I think it's going to be more developments and pressures within Myanmar that will be telling. The international community will do what it can. We certainly will do what we can to encourage a return to democracy as quickly as we can. And the second point I would make, going back to your earlier question about the Aung San Suu Kyi and whether her loss of some reputation internationally affected the coup plotters, it's hard to say. I would say that her defense of the nation, as Montazar put it, over the Rohingya crisis certainly hurt her internationally, but arguably made her more popular inside the country. And so in some ways, I'm not sure for the military if that made it easier or harder, because they care presumably much more about inside the country than outside the country.
Thank you. And thinking more about Myanmar's neighbors and the international community, Mo, you've had a long focus here on ASEAN. Looking at ASEAN, which has a policy of non-interference in domestic issues of its member states, how are ASEAN nations publicly or privately persuading the military to uphold democratic processes and rule of law, particularly those countries such as Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam, which have significant investments in Myanmar?
Similar to Ambassador Marcial, I will also have to start with the caveat that, I'm no longer with the ASEAN Secretariat. I left the Burmese Foreign Service since the year 2000, so I'm not clued into exactly how these bilateral or ASEAN regional diplomacy channels may be working. But based on the kind of exposure or experience that I have had in the past. I was on the team preparing for Myanmar's ASEAN membership, and I, did this stint at the ASEAN Secretariat where, the issue of, say, Myanmar's forced labor issue would appear year after year on, say, the ASEAN labor minister's agenda. So your question, Deborah, is really interesting and quite a coincidence, because I was just talking about this with a colleague earlier, and we were talking about exactly the same thing. So I think ASEAN has had the most experience in dealing with Myanmar under a military junta up close, whether individually through their bilateral channels with Myanmar, but also collectively at the regional level, at the meetings. And what's interesting is this regular reporting required on ASEAN's discussion agenda. There's this agenda item on the discussion agenda of the foreign ministers, of the senior officials, about the situation in Myanmar, where the Myanmar representative to these meetings has to give that update and brief the ASEAN counterparts on what's going on and field questions. So I think this item, which was taken off ASEAN's agenda for a very short while after the peaceful transition of power in 2015, after the 2015 elections, and with the NLDs taking off office in early 2016. It was reintroduced when the Rohingya crisis broke. So I think this agenda item can be used to more effect to ask probing questions, present suggestions or recommendations for monitoring, and perhaps couple that also with the kind of diplomatic channels that ASEAN uses, special envoys, bilateral discussions. But the thing is, Myanmar is also used to this through all the years of its membership from 1997 to 2010. It was under a very repressive military regime, and even being part of ASEAN, even with the technocrats' hope that, opening up through ASEAN, getting exposed through ASEAN would, bring them new ways of seeing, of thinking. I think, I guess there's this term that we use in the Burmese language, they are thick-skinned. So it's kind of like, they're kind of used to it. But again, knowing that whenever Myanmar attends a regional meeting, that its representative will have to answer questions from the ASEAN countries does keep them on their toes in a manner of speaking. And, I think we at least should be able to, ASEAN should at least be able to let the Myanmar representative know that, there will be a lot of probing questions asked.
Thanks for that. Ambassador Marcial, looking a little bit broader now at the international community, particularly at international commerce and business, how do you think Western and Chinese commercial interests are going to respond to the coup? And what's the balance there? Do we see Western interests really trying to pull out and then Chinese business taking over? Can you talk a little bit about what might be ahead?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure I have great answers. Western and particularly U.S. Obviously, there was a lot of interest, in 2012, 13, 14, 15. A lot of people saw Myanmar, a new market. Companies are always looking at the new emerging markets. That interest waned somewhat, even in 2016, early 2017. But certainly the Rohingya crisis discouraged Western investment. And then with COVID, so there's been a series of things that have kept the interest less than it otherwise would have been. So we're already operating at a reasonably low level. I think I'm guessing for U.S. companies, those that are there and those that are outside maybe looking are probably going to initially mostly take a wait and see attitude. It's still, less than a week after the coup. And I think like policymakers, they'll want to see, how things develop in the coming weeks. But it certainly does not send a positive signal to investors. I'm in no place to comment on and speak on behalf of what Chinese investors might think. Again, I would expect most business people who are making, to the extent they're making decisions on commercial basis as opposed to political basis, are going to want to take a wait and see approach and see, are there widespread protests? Does the civil disobedience campaign expand and take off? Does the military start to move in some way that suggests a return to some kind of better situation? So I think mostly a wait and see for now.
Great. We have a number of, thank you for that. We have a number of questions coming in from YouTube and Facebook and email. I'm going to turn to some of those now. So this is really to both of you. Facebook has become a major source of information and disinformation in Myanmar. It's basically seen as the internet there. Do you think Facebook will change its engagement or access with users in Myanmar so it doesn't become a larger tool for the military or possible misinformation and disinformation campaigns? And we know that Facebook is currently shut down in Myanmar by the military for the rest of the week, but how do you think Facebook itself will respond?
I'll start. Motuzar probably has more to say on this. When I was there, we had a lot of conversations with Facebook because, like in other places, some users were using it to spread misinformation and disinformation and often hateful messages. I think Facebook got some criticism for that and was working to try to be able to address it better. Again, I'm not in a position to speak for the company, but I think it's a constant challenge, not only in Myanmar, but in a lot of places for these social media platforms to try to make themselves available, make their platforms available, but also monitor and respond to, hate speech and disinformation. I think it's a work in progress. But beyond that, I don't have any specifics on what Facebook might do.
Mo, do you have any thoughts here?
Well, the military's news channel has been taken down in the immediate aftermath of the coup. Facebook took that down, so that's one thing. But I think it's also that uncertainty also of monitoring what's being posted in the local language, and I think that's where I think Facebook is really trying to also build up its technical expertise and also the range of people who can look at that, because when you can catch certain terms and words and phrases, if they're posting in English, when they start posting in Burmese or other ethnic national languages and so on, it becomes a little bit that much more difficult to capture. I think I mentioned earlier now that there's this migration to Twitter and to Signal. So communication is going on there, and I think the Myanmar Twitterverse has expanded, but there is also and I think what I observe is this increasing amount of skepticism of messages of support or certain encouragements, because there's this new empressement netizens now have with this whole notion of psychological warfare. So there is this awareness that in the same way that Myanmar netizens are using alternative social media platforms, messaging platforms other than Facebook and Messenger, they're also aware that the military can also create fake accounts, release bots and rats and whatever have you, and also monitor what's going on in the Twitterverse.
Thank you. Ambassador Marcial, this question is to you from a watcher. So on the new cabinet in Burma, some feel that it also contains many hardliners, which it does, and many who keep the military entrenched. Of those new cabinet members, what's your feeling about those that you've interacted with? What are your concerns going forward about how they've done their jobs in the past and what their kind of outlooks are?
I haven't looked closely at the cabinet members. Some of them I worked with quite a bit when I was there, and they were in different roles. Others not so much. Honestly speaking, I don't think the cabinet is the issue. The issue is that the military has grabbed power and is repressing the people and cabinet members in the end will have to do what they're told to do. So I don't want to, demean anyone individually, but I don't think the issue is the cabinet members. I think the issue is the bigger question of the military haven't grabbed power, that when it's just received a huge message from the Myanmar voters that we don't want the military to rule us. That's the issue, not, I don't mean to be disrespectful, but that's the issue, not which cabinet members got which jobs.
Sure. And you had mentioned previously that Aung San Suu Kyi remains the most popular person in the country. And we've seen that the military has just charged her with owning or having some illegal walkie-talkies in her house. What are the ways that Min Aung Hlaing and the military is trying to handle her, whether it's detain her for longer, keep her out of government for longer, or what other options are there really?
Shall I take a stab at that first?
Sure.
This to me really smacks of a page out of the SLOC playbook, whereby the intention is to discredit Aung San Suu Kyi as the face of resistance, as the face of the democracy movement, which she still is, and also to, by extension, to discredit the National League for Democracy, which to them over the past 3-4 decades has always presented, I think, that main threat, if I could use that word. So whenever it comes to this transition to democracy and managing democracy, for the military, it seems that the nemesis always has been the National League for Democracy, way back since 1988. And I think the consistent efforts since then, since the SLOC days that we have seen of trying to discredit Aung San Suu Kyi and also the NLD, to the point where when the NLD boycotted the 2010 elections because they were obviously going to be, rigged in a certain way, that was used as a reason to declare that the NLD was an illegal organization and trying to, compel it to disband. So I think, again, I mean, this is probably me getting a little bit emotional, but yes, basically it's a page out of the SLOC playbook.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. I mean, if you look at the history in 2003, after people associated with the military regime attacked Aung San Suu Kyi's convoy in Depayin, killing a large number of people and almost murdering Aung San Suu Kyi, the military responded by arresting her and putting her back under house arrest. And in 2009, when an American swam to her residence while she was under house arrest, the military arrested and prosecuted her, apparently for not sufficiently protecting herself or ensuring the security of her house arrest. So there's a history of these sort of absurd legal arguments. But I think that experience is it hasn't worked. I mean, yes, they can detain her. They have the guns, and they can certainly detain her. But it hasn't worked in terms of changing the views of the public toward her and the NLD. And I think it's important. Also, Aung San Suu Kyi's very important player, has been for a long time. Certainly the most popular politician in the country. But the democracy movement isn't just about Aung San Suu Kyi, and I think. People in Myanmar, even though things have, they've had plenty of challenges in recent years, they have had a taste of much greater freedom and democracy. You have more than 100 political parties, I think, competed in the last election. So there's political competition. There's a lot greater freedom, at least up until the coup, than there had been, even if it was less than ideal. And so I think it's Aung San Suu Kyi is certainly hugely important, but it's beyond that. And I think I have no way of predicting how this is going to play out. But to me, the last two elections have been very much pro Aung San Suu Kyi, but just as much, if not more, I don't want to say even anti-military, but anti-military rule. And I think there's overwhelming support for that in the country. And I don't see anything the military can do to change that.
If I could just jump in, yes,
Please.
Ambassador Marcel, it's really important what you've highlighted, and I think if the intention was to take Aung San Suu Kyi out of the political equation with this kind of move, I think it's backfired in the sense that if anything now she's sort of become that rallying point of focus, even with that diverse participatory, multi-party political environment emerging. So that's one point. And the other point was, the other point that I wanted to make in support of Ambassador Marcel's comment was also that, with this, I think the country has also become very polarized in terms of, those polarized in the sense that with this overwhelming support that has been demonstrated in the 2020 elections, with the military takeover now, those who are supporting the military regime, those in the military who have probably no choice but to uphold this, and the whole rest of the country, the electorate and supporters who have voted for change and democracy and who have expressed that they do not want a future where the military has such a large role in the country anymore. So that's the sad result as well. And the coup has just probably made that entrenched divide even wider, I think.
Thank you for that. We're getting a number of questions in about trying to understand current US sanctions policy, and then if a possibly bellicose China discourse in the US will cause the US to potentially restrain any new sanctions policy to foster ties with Myanmar. So just the first point of that, Ambassador, if you could just comment on the current sanctions on the military, because my understanding is there isn't a lot of additional exposure that they could have to any additional sanctions, that the military is actually quite heavily sanctioned by the US already. Is that the case?
There's some targeted sanctions on the military. Back in before 2000, or before the reforms began, we had quite widespread sanctions, as you know, that targeted not only the military but a lot of other players in the economy, and even prohibitions on new investments and great restrictions on imports, all that sort of stuff. So those broad sanctions were all lifted in 2016. Since in the last few years, the United States has imposed targeted sanctions under the so-called global Magnitsky sanctions against a small number of senior military officials, and including General Min Aung Hlaing, his deputy, General So Win, and a handful of others. So again, I don't want to try to predict what might happen because I don't know. But based on the comments from Jake Sullivan yesterday, it sounds like they're doing a review to see of whether there's other individuals in the military or entities under the military that could be hit with targeted sanctions. My understanding is that review is underway, so they haven't made any decisions. The challenge, of course, with sanctions is there's not a lot of evidence that the military officials in question have particular assets or business with the United States that would be affected by sanctions. So, finding sanctions that are both targeted and that cause create some incentive for the military to change its behavior is really challenging.
Thank you for that. There's also a question here that talks a little bit about ethnic peace talks. So Myanmar has been in civil war for about 70 years. There's been a peace process underway, ceasefire process underway, but constant violent conflict flare-ups throughout the country. What does the coup mean for ethnic peace talks? But also, can there be any kind of carrots and sticks tied to an ethnic peace process in the broader kind of response to the coup, international response to the coup?
I think I would look at it from the point of view of broken trust and broken promises, because during the SLORC SPDC days of the military junta, there were moves to engage the ethnic armed groups, and I think former General Kim Yun was very much a proponent of that, and they initiated these talks and what they called quote unquote gentlemen's agreements. I doubt whether there were gentlemen on both sides, but facetiousness apart. So there were these overtures made for negotiating some kind of ceasefire and peace agreements with the ethnic armed groups by the military junta. But then again, I think what happened was when the suggestion came from the junta's side that they wanted the ethnic armed groups to somehow convert into border guard forces and be under the command of a Burmese commander-in-chief, I think there was some disappointment and so on. And then, you know, the USDP administration time, then President Thein Sein initiated this nationwide ceasefire agreement and then tried to start to formalize these negotiations and so on. And his aim, his deliverable for that 5-year term was to basically broker that peace agreement with the 16 main armed ethnic groups. But he only managed to get about half of them to sign before the USDP term ended. And so when the NLD came into office, I think the ethnic armed groups were also looking at a new set of negotiators and so on. So again, this is just a very long rambling way of saying that I think on the part of the ethnic armed groups, there is this notion of broken trust or broken promises, and you know, what is it that we can really expect from the negotiators? So I think that's the kind of attitude and notion that still is hanging over the peace process.
Yeah, if I could just add very quickly, I certainly agree with that. There's very little trust, and I think a lot of the ethnic communities and ethnic armed groups were somewhat disappointed by the NLD government in the peace process. But my sense is generally, if you had to ask them, what's the fundamental obstacle, it's more the military. And even these days, we're seeing military operations in Karen area, for example. It's causing thousands of people to be displaced. So these are continuing. It'll be very interesting. I haven't seen anything the last few days what happens with whether the sort of informal ceasefire with the Arakan army in Rakhine State continues. I have no way of knowing, but to date, you know, the military is continuing to do what it's been doing for the last 50 years.
And do you expect additional flare-ups and violent conflict now that the military has taken control? So
I hope not, but that's a hope. I don't feel like the military felt particularly constrained in carrying out military operations, even under the NLD government, because the NLD government couldn't stop them. So I'm not sure that the level of constraint, or such as it was, that the military faces changed one way or the other.
Talking about the military and ethnic states, so when the Thein Sein government took control in 2011, one of the first things that they did related to an ethnic state is suspend the Myitsone Dam project, the giant dam project with China that gave 90% of the energy to China. The military has long been upset with that, as have the Chinese. Do we think that we're going to see projects like that that are really not to the benefit of Myanmar and definitely to the detriment of ethnic states kind of proliferate under this new military government? Mo, do you want to take a stab first?
I was smiling because, you know, the Myitsone Dam project remains suspended.
Right.
And of course, one of the big question marks about, you know, of the NLD's first term was really, you know, is the NLD going to continue with the suspension? So there was, I guess, neither a confirmation or a denial of the continuing of suspension, but nevertheless, the project remains suspended. And so that's, I think that's one of the things that also relates to how people view these big infrastructure projects from China. And let's not forget, there are all these Belt and Road Initiative projects that have been lined up and proposed and you know, in the pipeline. So So what I do understand is that, of course, the NLD government was trying to negotiate more in terms of that kind of transparency and consultative inclusion of, the community stakeholders in whose areas the projects might be cited or were being planned to be cited. So this whole notion of responsible business, responsible investing, I think was starting to take root in Myanmar. The Myanmar Center for Responsible Business, of course, is also trying to do its bit by flagging the kind of the transparency in the business operations and budget reporting and so on. So there was that culture starting to take root, and now everything's up in the air. So it also depends, I think, on this empressement of what it is to do to invest responsibly and sustainably in Myanmar, and how will that continue?
And Mo, we have another question coming in for you. As protests get larger in Myanmar against the military coup, do you think that the military is going to react similarly as it did in previous years? So will there be kind of grave responses from the military? And how far do you think they're going to let protests go?
I mean, we all look back to like past precedents, but the past should not always dictate or predict the future. And in this instance, with all my heart, I hope and pray not, because all the memories that are thrown up, all the unpleasant memories that are thrown up for those of us who lived through the 1988 democracy protest aftermath, and who witnessed the 2007 Saffron Revolution and how the responses were to that. I think that there is, of course, that very real and valid concern of what will happen now. But as Ambassador Marcel has also observed, it's about 5 days into the coup from where I'm sitting. And yes, the civil disobedience movement has gained momentum across the country. There have been instances of street protests as well. But, we haven't heard of shots being fired. And again, I hope with all my heart that, and pray that it will not be so.
Thank you. We're about to hit our hour mark here. I want to ask if either of you have any final thoughts you want to share with our audience or with the people of Myanmar.
Well, I'd just maybe two thoughts. One, obviously, for all of our friends and all the people out there, you have a lot of support around the world from the United States and from many other places. The second is, I think, for all of us, it's really hard, certainly for policymakers in Washington and everywhere. You operate in a time horizon where you're trying to make things happen quickly. You're trying to, do what you can to reverse what just happened, and or at least move it in a much better direction. But the other, and that's going to continue. But I think it's really important also that this process of trying to build not only more democracy, but peace with a federal union in which the ethnic minorities feel that they're respected and treated with dignity and have their rights is a long-term process. And for all of us outside Myanmar, it's not just the coup, but keeping in mind the importance of continuing to do everything we can to support the longer-term process, even though there's been obviously a huge setback this week.
And Mo, any final thoughts?
I would add to that, and speaking as a Myanmar citizen who also voted for change through all the past elections, I think it's important for all of us to remember that this is a marathon. This is the long haul. This is a trek that requires sustained energy and endurance, and we can't also I think dismiss the coup and the generals as people who are acting irrationally. They may not be as stuck in the past as we like to think. And so I think all our actions and responses in showing that we are committed to continuing to see through this process of change and transition towards democracy in the country, I think it behoves all of us to work smart. and you know, fight facts with facts and intellectually.
Thank you. My thanks to both of our excellent speakers today, Ambassador Marcial Mokhthuzar. Thank you for being here. And to our friends in Myanmar, we wish you a very swift return to civilian role and to better days ahead. Thank you all.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you to Asia